All right, in part one, we talked about how we have our chip, and then with our chip, what we're going to do is we're going to use cables to plug in power and inputs and outputs. Okay, so we're going to take this and we're going to expand upon it a little bit. So here we have our chip, and then the other thing that we have on this diagram right here is we have jumper wires, and this is what you're going to find in the labs. We have little wires we're going to use as our cables to plug in. Now, the thing that's going to become a little bit hard is as you can kind of get an idea of this is here you have the cable, you have an end of these jumper wires, and then these jumper wires you're going to have to connect to the chip. So trying to connect one of those wires to one end of this chip is going to be a little bit difficult. To make it a little bit easier, what we're going to do is we're going to take our chip, and what we're going to think about doing is taking a piece of metal and running that metal all the way down where all these little pins are. So we're in essence trying to expand how wide those pins are. And all this chip's going to do is it's going to sit on top of this metal. And then when we have our wire, what we're going to do with our wire is we're going to have our wire touch that piece of metal. And anything that touches this little small piece of metal that is extending out is all going to make a connection. As long as two pieces of metal touch, they're going to be connected, electricity will flow. Okay, so here's our chip for the example that we did, and I extended out all the pins so that we have a piece of metal extending out. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take our power source and take a wire into that power source. We're going to connect one of it onto this pin 14 for 5 volts. We're going to take another one. We're going to connect it on to this pin 7 for our ground. As long as these wires are touching that piece of metal and the pins are touching the metal, we have connection. Then we're going to take one of our light switches. We're going to connect it, take a wire. We're going to put that wire on the input for pin number 1. Take the other one, other switch, put a wire on it, make it touch the metal for pin number 2. And then we take our output, a piece of wire, touch that metal, connect it onto our LED, and then we can have our circuit worked. Now, how we're going to get all of these little strips of metal and how we're going to have everything be held down? Well, that's going to give us into a breadboard. So, okay, so here's a picture of a breadboard. And on this breadboard, we have one of our chips. Now, remember, I talked about in part one, there's a little indicator so you know what the top is. Okay, on this breadboard, all the way going down the side, you see that there are numbers 1, 2, 3, all the way to 30, 1, 2, 30. And then we have letters on the columns. It would have been nice if, the numbers would have been different across both sides, but that's just the way this is set up. Okay, so we have a right side and we have a left side. Okay, on this breadboard here, where that pin goes into that plastic, that is that strip of metal that we have. So every one of those pins is on one of these rows. Everything on that row is all connected together. So for example, all of those holes on row 19 are all connected together. But we have this big break in the center, and that big break in the center separates the left side from the right side. So here, let me do a different color. This green is all connected, but the green is not the same as the other side of the 19, which is in gray. They're two different pieces of wire. So if you go back to here, you see how I did not have the wire from one going all the way across to connect to 14. Here, this 13 column, row 13, we have a left side, which is separate from the right side. The other thing you're going to see on a lot of these breadboards is you'll see a whole side that's red with a plus and a whole side that is minus with blue. We usually use the plus and the minus to be our voltage. So we usually do the plus to be our 5 volts and our 0 volts, our ground, to be the blue. So I got to connect pin 14 to the 5 volts. I would take a jumper wire, connect that wire onto this vertical plus 5, and then I'll take that wire and I'll connect it onto one of those little holes that we have on the breadboard on pin 14. And then the same thing I would do on pin 19. Take a jumper wire, connect it to somewhere on row 19, and then connect it into that blue side of the 0 volts. And that's how we connect the power. Then later we would have wrong picture. Then later we're going to have our light switches and our LEDs. And we'll take our switch and let's do the reach here. The whole row on pin number 1 is all connected. We'll take a wire, make that wire connect onto that row 13, and then connect it to our switch. And we'll do the same thing for our second switch and for our LED. All right, so that gives us to part 2. On part 3, we're going to use a simulator. I'm going to show you the connections that we're going to make on that simulator. And then in part 4, I'll show you a physical board.